Now, Israel under continued pressure to provide a full, transparent explanation after 7 aid workers, including 3 British Special Forces veterans, were killed in an airstrike on Gaza. An Israeli Defense Force chief has said it shouldn't have happened and blamed the strike on complex conditions. Rishi Sunak revealed he spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last night and called for an independent investigation into what happened.
Yeah, it's a awful, awful tragedy to think that these were brave Brits who were actually risking their lives to bring aid to people in need in Gaza. To have lost their lives in these circumstances is tragedy. My thoughts, obviously, with their family and their friends at this time. You know, I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu last night and was very clear with him that the situation is increasingly intolerable, and what we urgently need to see is a thorough, transparent investigation into what has happened, but also a dramatic increase in the amount of aid getting into Gaza, removing the barriers, but also closer work with aid agencies to make sure things like this don't happen again.
And you can hear that full interview with Rishi Sunak speaking with Harry Cole on Never Mind the Ballots tonight at 8 p.m. on TalkTV. Mr. Sunak's government is now under pressure to halt arms sales to Israel following the deadly attack. Now, the Telegraph columnist Madeline Grant is still with us as well, looking at the day's news, including a big focus on what's been happening in Israel. And joining us also is military analyst and former British Army officer Colonel Simon Diggins. Simon, good afternoon to you.
Ian, good afternoon, Madeline.
Good to have you with us. Clearly, this was an absolute a lethal disaster on Israel's part with this fatal airstrike. Just give us your response, if you would, please.
I mean, I think certainly, firstly, the government's line is they need to understand what's happened is absolutely clear. There's clearly been a significant miscalculation by the Israelis, and the circumstances are still not there. I mean, the head of the Israeli armed forces said this was a mistake. He blamed the complex situation, which is absolutely correct. There is a complex situation on the ground. But there is, unfortunately, a suspicion that the Israelis themselves overall are, shall we say, almost sort of trigger happy. In other words, if they're concerned about something, they'll fire first and ask questions later. But these vehicles were clearly marked. They were clearly marked, and they'd also, according to reports that have come through, this has come through Israeli sources, saying they'd also notified the Israelis to tell them what they were doing. So they were not in any way moving in sort of cavalier fashion around the area. So there are some real questions about the degree of coordination within Israel to their forces who've got control of triggers about what they're actually doing and what they're not doing. So clearly something has gone very, very badly wrong.
Yeah, and I think you rightly alluded at the beginning there, Simon, to some of the areas that can go wrong in all is fair in love and war and all the rest of it. You know, we understand that, and complex situations can mean, if you're on the ground, split-second decisions. It can be very difficult. You know that better than most. But there certainly does seem to be what some are calling a disproportionate amount of evidence towards the IDF. We saw just before Christmas 3 of their own hostages who were shot, again, in situation that many suggested, again, unless you were there at the time, it's hard to tell, but many suggested it was quite clear. And yet the shooting went ahead and 3 people lost their lives. Is this a game changer, though, Simon? Many are saying this is a pivotal moment in the way the rest of the world, this country, the United States and others, respond to what is happening in Israel.
I think potentially it is, because I think what it's brought home is, if you like, some of the conditions and some of the consequences of Israeli actions that certainly Palestinians and also UN agencies have been saying has been the case on the ground for a while. Now, elements of those UN agencies are accused of being tainted by involvement with Hamas, and to some extent, as a result, some of the evidence has been disputed. This occasion here now, we've had three Britons killed, plus others from, if you like, the wider world community. And so it's brought home to other people what actually has happened. But it is, as indeed Prime Minister Sunak has said, it's indicative of something which is much, much wider. Basically, an attitude among elements of the Israeli Defense Force where they appear to be wanting to acting with impunity. I'm absolutely certain, from what I know of senior Israeli officers, those are not the orders or instructions that they're being given. But somewhere between, if you like, the instructions from senior Israeli officers and what's actually happening on the ground, there is a disconnect. And the disconnect is killing a lot of people who should not be killed. It happens to be 3 Britons at the moment. And again, people are going to argue about the figures. We've had over 32,000 Palestinian civilians killed in this conflict so far. And those are massive, massive numbers, completely disproportionate to the military effect achieved. And people have been arguing about it, but I think this, very sadly, and it's happened to 3 Britons, really brings home what's going on in Gaza, and it's not very pretty.
Israel, of course, will continue to argue, Simon, they are in an impossible situation. They have spent years with rockets being fired over into their terrain, into their country, and haven't mostly responded to that when it does happen, but it's a weekly occurrence. They are fighting, after all, a terror group that are in charge of that country, with a lot of support in that country as well. And yes, the death toll is huge. If you speak to people in Germany about Dresden many years ago, they would perhaps find a similar argument there, I suppose. Again, it comes back to the complex situation. Do you have a sympathy, though, with that complexity that Israel are facing? Because it is, after all, the country that ultimately is protecting itself.
No, I mean, totally. I mean, I speak as somebody who is a strong supporter of the survival of Israel and its absolute right to self-defense against what is, I absolutely accept, a vicious terrorist organization. The awful massacre on October 7th, the fact that the 134 hostages are still being held is a real challenge to them. But I would argue that despite all that, there are ways of approaching and dealing with Hamas that do not require what effectively has been, the mass forcing out of population, a failure to deliver humanitarian aid, which really got nothing to do with Hamas, and what looks to me less than stringent rules of engagement. At the end of the day, Israel's security is not going to come from killing how many left of the Hamas, 2,000, 3,000 Hamas left. Israel's security is going to come from the people of Palestine and Israel separately concluding that they're better off working together despite their differences. That's real security. And the kind of logic of counterinsurgency or counterterrorism fighting, which we learned very painfully in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, is that if you kill one, you create 10 more. Now that's people like General Stan McChrystal, absolutely top-notch US Special Forces general. And that's what the message he hammered home when he was in Afghanistan. And it's a lesson that we, the British, through many, many years of not dissimilar campaigning, have learned and learned painfully. And that's something which I think the Israelis know this, but at the moment, at the political level, strategic level, they're not prepared to countenance what it means, which is a different approach to dealing with Hamas, which at the end of the day, creates a situation, creates a scenario in which there can be some kind of independent Palestinian state. That's where true security is going to come. I mean, you kill one, you create 10,000. That is a logic of this kind of warfare. It's a war amongst the people. And at some point, you need to do something which brings the people onto your side. And this sort of instance simply doesn't do that.